All right, well, let's head overseas at the moment. What do you make? You're a military expert, of course, in your history. What do you make of what's going on in the Ukraine?
Well, right now it's at a tipping point. The Ukrainian military, the Russian military is kind of very near collapse. Right now, there's in the report in the last 12 hours, there's a lot of those newly mobilized troops that were basically snatched off the streets, had no equipment, no training, are already starting to take a lot of casualties. And this just in the last hour, couple of hours, is that a bunch of people in Moscow and the city government there have just started to walk out in mass. I mean, there's mass walkouts now of Moscow city government in protest of one of their own that was mobilized and killed within a few days of getting to the front with no training. So in the southern Ukraine, you have the Russian 59th Army Group pinned between the Dnieper River and the Ukrainians, and the Russians have no way to either evacuate or extract them. And should 15 to 20,000 Russian troops be forced to surrender in the coming weeks, that may be a mortal blow to Putin. But it's hard to see how the Russians regain the initiative here. It's just a question of when and how they lose.
What about the continual rattling of the nuclear sabre?
Well, obviously, anytime you talk about nuclear weapons, that's a matter of concern for the world. So you don't want to ever make light of that. Battlefield nuclear weapons are of limited military utility to the Russians because of the dispersed nature of Ukrainian forces. They would have to use 5 to 10 of them to achieve any military result, other than kill just 10 or 12 tanks. Other problem the Russians have is that once you set off a nuclear weapon, you can't just go fight in that area. Troops have to be specially trained and equipped, and that means suits, that means tanks even, and armored personnel carriers have to be specially equipped to operate in a nuclear environment. Otherwise, you're going to end up killing almost as many of your own troops as you are of the enemy due to radiological concerns. And that's a problem the Russians have. And not to mention, the least of which is if Putin were to authorize the use of nuclear weapons, it's not just a question of pushing a button. It has to go through the Russian chain of command all the way through the battlefield commanders on the ground. And there's real questions whether or not such an order would even be carried out.
Yeah, and that's one point that hasn't been emphasised enough is nuclear weapons, basically, because they border Ukraine, it's almost bombing yourself.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you don't know which way the winds are going to go. I mean, for example, the Russians, they're damned either way. If the winds go east and it lands in Russian territory, that's a big political problem for Putin. Conversely, if they go west, that's arguably into Poland or into, the Baltic states. That's arguably an attack on them which would trigger Article 5. So there's very little downside for the Russians to use battlefield nuclear weapons. The one thing, however, that I would look for is perhaps an EMP attack, and that is a nuclear detonation up in space over Kiev. The immediate effects of such a blast wouldn't kill or harm a single living thing on Earth, but it would do is fry communications over an extended area. And that may be a way for the Russians to demonstrate their willingness to use nuclear weapons without taking some of the risks and incurring some of the costs.
A fair bit of the rhetoric that comes out of Vladimir Putin, obviously, when he talks about the West and the US and all of us, really, he says, well, I'll come back at you. And that it's a veiled threat of some sort of nuclear weapon being pointed outside the area at someone else. What do you think the likelihood of that would be?
Well, I mean, it's actually pointed out he freaking hates us, all of us. That includes all of us.
You and me, we're in this together, John.
We sure are. Well, we've always been in it together, our two countries. But the bottom line is that people don't realize that nuclear weapons aren't something you just build and forget about. They have to be maintained, periodically taken apart completely and remanufactured. Given the state of the Russian conventional military forces and the Russian overall defense budget is only 7.5% of the U.S. budget. Have the Russians been maintaining not only the warheads, but these delivery systems? How reliable and how effective are these things? And I think these are valid questions. And any unreliability or perceived unreliability may give the Russians room for pause.
He's got a lot of guns pointing at him at the moment, too, which doesn't get mentioned very often.
Yeah, I'm sorry?
He's got a lot of guns pointing at him, which he doesn't get a lot of mention in worldwide media when we're covering this. From outside the US, from outside Russia, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, the big question is, where does Russia go from this, right? I mean, they're going to be a pariah, and if they use nuclear weapons, I mean, you're already seeing China and India back off. I mean, even they abstained in the UN resolution condemning the annexation of the 4 Ukrainian provinces. You saw Russia just be humiliated in front of the UN General Assembly with their supposed allies, India and China backing off. So it's really hard to see how Putin survives this in the intermediate term.
Yeah, let's hope he's gone soon. John, just finally, quickly, back home, inflation. I know I don't want to, it's not a very bright spot. I'd rather finish on tasting one of your lovely Chardonnays. But inflation in the US, not real flash.
Inflation is a bigger problem. That's become the dominant political issue in this country, the economy. You're starting to see in the last few days surveys show that it and crime are dominating the American political landscape now, to the exclusion pretty much of all else. And that's kind of understandable. Inflation is nowhere near under control. The CPI and the producer's price increase still spiking in spite of aggressive action by the American Central Bank. It's going to be painful to bring that down, and it's going to be a political issue, certainly in the midterm, and maybe in the beginning of the presidential cycle as well.
Absolutely. Well, good to chat. Hopefully we'll catch up next week.
Look forward to it.